Hello student, how are you all? I hope you all are alright. Today we are going to read about the Age of Dryden. That is about his verse. The Age of Dryden, the Stuart Restoration was followed by an immense change in the general temper of the English people, a sweeping reaction against Puritanism and everything that it had stood for set in, and this reaction went so far that together with the galling restraints which religious fanaticism had unwisely imposed, moderation and decency were too often cast aside. England now touched low water mark in its social history. The court of Charles II was the most shameless this country has ever known. Infidelity and profligacy became fashionable. The moral ideals of Puritanism were turned into jest, and those who still upheld the cause of domestic virtue laughed at as hypocrites or denounced as sore sectaries. Even outside the narrow circle of court and aristocracy, where things were at their worst, the spirit of corruption spread far and wide, and while pity and goodness were of course cherished among individuals, the general lowering of the moral tone was everywhere apparent. The effect of these conditions on literature will be anticipated by all who recall the great principle of interpretation which preceding chapters have now made clear, that literature is a social product and inevitably reflects the life of the era out of which it springs. The literature of Age of Dryden was at times openly and defiantly corrupt, while even at its best, though it had many admirable qualities, it was generally wanting in moral strength and spiritual fervor. Real earnestness of purpose had passed away, and with this strong passion and with this strong is this again great creative energy. The thoughts of man no longer scaled the heights, they moved along the plain. Literature ceased to soar and become pedestrian. Thus, with the Restoration, we enter upon a period in which literature is intellectual rather than imaginative or emotional, and though often brilliant, is on the whole a trifle hard and unsympathetic. This is true even of poetry, which became prosaic, was made to do the work of prose, and was judged by the standard of prose. The poet did not allow his thoughts to wander off with Spenser into fairyland, or to explore with Milton the mysteries of heaven and hell. He made his verse the vehicle arguments, controversy, personal and political satire. The era of the versified pamphlet thus began. This is a striking illustration of the changed mood of the time. Even more significant perhaps is the fact that the men of the Restoration were real creators of our modern English prose. In further illustration of the qualities of the literature of this period, we must remember the direct and powerful influence exerted upon it by France. The European supremacy of Italy and now passed away, the France had become the world great arbiter of taste. The political relations between the two countries naturally tended to give vogue in England to all things French, including French taste and French ideas of art. Now the contemporary literature of France was characterized particularly by lucidity, vivacity, and by reason of the close attention given to form, correctness, elegance, and finish. It was essentially by a literature of polite society and had all the merit and all the limitation of such a literature. It was moreover a literature in which intellectual was in the ascendant and critical faculty always in control. It was to this congenial literature that English writers now learned to look for guidance, and thus a great impulse was given to the development alike in our prose and in our verse of the principle of regularity and order and the spirit of good sense. As in verse eminently, these were now cultivated at the expense of feeling and spontaneity. The growth of an artificial type of poetry was the inevitable result. The forerunner of Dryden was the forerunner of the Dryden. Okay. Of this epoch, Dryden, the greatest man of a little age, as he has been called, was the one complete representative and exponent. But before we turn to his work, we must say a word about two writers, both some year his elders, whom he himself regarded as his masters and who are still commonly considered the pioneers of the so-called classic school of poetry, Edmund Waller and Sir John Denham. In general, these two writers were leaders in the reaction in tests against the excesses and obscurity of the metaphysical poets and in favor of good sense and the neatness and clearness of expression. In particular, they were the reformer of English versification at a time when it had become insufferably rugged and harsh. It is indeed on his later side mainly that they possess historical importance. This is especially true of Walter. The excellence and dignity of rhyme, said Dryden, were never fully known till Waller taught it. He first made writing easily an art, first showed how to conclude the sense most commonly distinguished which in verse of those before. Now moving toward the page number 4. Hymn runs on for so many lines together that the reader is out of breath to overtake it. This reshaping of heroic couplet is Waller's principal claim to distinction. He brought into use that kind of heroic couplet which we know as the classic or close form, in which the rule is that instead of the sense being allowed to flow on from couplet to couplet indefinitely, it should habitually close with the end of the second line, the metrical pause and the rhetoric pause thus coming together. Dryden, who, as will be observed, writes extravagantly in Waller's praise, is wrong in supposing that this close couplet was actually that poet's invention. It had been used from time to time by many earlier writers, but when Waller began his work, the tendency was wholly away from it towards a kind of verse so loose as to be almost formless, and it is from him that the new movement may fairly be said to the dead. The classic couplet did not reach its final shape in his hands as a specific form. It evolved gradually and assumed perfection first in the work of its greatest master Pope, but Waller led the way. Then Denham, now chiefly remembered for his descriptive poem Cooper's Hill, followed of Waller and Denham together. Dryden wrote our numbers versification were in their nonage till these last appeared. Dryden's life. John Dryden was born at Aldwinkle, All Saints, Nottinghamshire in 1631, was educated at Westminster and at Trinity College, Cambridge, and settled in London about 1657. Soon after this, he wrote his first poem of any importance by heroic stanzas on the death of Oliver Cromwell. 1659, the indicative of rapid change of front, Austria Redux, in celebration of the happy restoration of Charles II. In 1663, he began to work from the stage, which was then the only profitable held for anyone who had to depend for his livelihood upon his pen, and for some 15 years playwriting continued to be chief occupation. In 1670 he was made poet laureate, and 1681 opened a new chapter of his career with the publication of the first of his great satire in verse, Absalom and Achitophel. This was followed by other work of same character, and later by two theological poems, Religio Laici and Defense of the Church of England, the Hind and the Panther, an elaborate argument in favor of Roman Catholicism, to which in the meantime he had been converted, and consequence of this change of religion, the revolution of 1688 came upon him. As a heavy blow, he lost his position of poet laureate, and all hopes of official recognition now being destroyed, devoted himself for his remaining years to literature with praiseworthy courage and industry. He produced 5 more plays, translation of Juvenal, Persius, and Virgil, and a volume of fables or phrases from Homer, Ovid, Boccaccio, and Chaucer. These were published in November 1699. 6 months later, in May 1700, and he died. Dryden poetry. Of Dryden work in prose and the drama we shall speak in our next chapter. Here we have to deal only with his verse. As an poet, he repenned very slowly. His first poem, an elegy on the death of young Lord Hastings, written at 18, is almost incredibly bad. His heroic stanzas were at 27, though they contain a few fine lines, and images are crude and bombastic. For the time being, he was greatly influenced by Colley, whom he afterwards described as darling of my youth, and as a result all the characteristic absurdity of the metaphysical school about these early years, they survive even in Annus Mirabilis, in which writing of two great events of the wonderful years, the war with Holland and the fire of London, he indulges from time to time in the most fantastic conceit, as when, for example, he depicts the deity extinguishing the conflagration with a hollow crystal pyramid, precisely in the way in which himself was accustomed to put out his own candle. But though its faults are numerous and glaring, the masculine vigor and lucidity of the poem reveal the immense development in writer genius. For the full exhibition of his power, however, we have to turn to the work of the last 20 years of his life, in which his emancipation from the false tales of the metaphysical writers is complete, and his style no longer turbid and choked with all sort of rubbish, flows clear and strong. This work, which marks the definite establishment of the classic school of poetry in England, may be dealt with under 3 heads. First, the political satire, Absalom and Achitophel, written amid the excitement following the alleged popish plot to defend the king's policy against the Earl of Shaftesbury, and especially famous for its powerful character studies as the Shaftesbury himself under the name of Achitophel, and the Duke of Buckingham under that of Zimri. The medal, the further invective against Shaftesbury and MacFlecknoe, a scathing personal attack on a former friend Thomas Shadwell, who had replied to the medal in poem filled with scurrilous abuse. Second, the two great doctrine poems, Religio Laici and The Hind and the Panther. These are not in the strict sense religious. There is nothing devotional or spiritual about them. They are theological and controversial, and written as are from two opposed point of view. They are curiously interesting as exhibiting Dryden's mastery in the conduct of argument in verse, and his extraordinary skill is making the most of whatever position he might for the moment adopt. His mental flexibility and agility gave him remarkable power as a special pleader. The third, the fables. These fine tales were amid the anxieties of Dryden's last year and under the increasing burden of age, ill health. So far from suggesting any flagging of energy, rather show poet almost at his best and give him a title to rank among our best storyteller in verse. The Palamon and Arcite, based upon the Knight's Tale of Chaucer, provide an opportunity for the most instructive comparison between the method and the art of 14th century and those of the 17th century poets. Dryden's poetry, alike in its limitation and in its merits, is thoroughly representative of the age. As a whole, it is marked by a general want of what we are accustomed to call the essential poetic qualities. It has little imaginative power, little depth of feeling, little spiritual glow or fervor, and except here and there, as in the two remarkable odes to the memory of Mrs. Anne Killigrew and Alexander's Feast, it rarely touches a high lyrical note. On the other hand, it is characterized by splendid intellectuality and a manly vigor of style. If Dryden is seldom poetic, he at least gives us many passages of wonderful strength and eloquence. It is therefore easy to see why he holds his own as a satirist and reasoner in verse. In both these fields, the author of Absalom and Achitophel and the Religio Laici is still our greatest master. It was Dryden's influence and example which lifted the classic couplet into the place it was to occupy for many years as the accepted measure of serious English poetry. When he began to write, he, like the literary world in general, was in a state of uncertainty in regard to the best form to adopt. Thus we find him fluctuating between the Gondibert stanza in poem on Oliver Cromwell and Annus Mirabilis and the regular couplet in Astrea Redux and the panegyric on the coronation with Absalom and Achitophel. He made his final choice of latter form, and by his splendid use of it proved its capabilities and absurd its success. Butler. Only one other poet of the period is important enough to detain us here, and he lives entirely on the strength of one work. This is Samuel Butler, author of the famous Hudibras, the three parts of which were published in 1663, 1664 and 1678. A satire on the Puritans. Hudibras instantly hit the test of the time and by its popularity greatly stimulated the general reaction against the saints and their cause. The machinery of the poem is obviously fashioned Don Quixote for like that wonderful Spanish burlesque romance. It tells of the mid-adventures of the knight and his squires and the knight's ill fortunes in love. In the two central figures, the author holds up to our contempt two contrasted representatives of Puritanism, the Presbyterian Sir Hudibras himself being a military enthusiast who though unconsciously a good deal of hypocrite, is not consciously sincere, while his attendant Ralpho is a vulgar canting impostor who merely assumed the mask of virtue for his own profit. The story begins with an attempt of these two to put down a bear baiting which involves them in a tremendous conflict with the rebel and leads to their being set by the heel in the parish stock. This is the most amusing portion of the book. Other incidents follow which keep up the interest till well on into the second part, but after this the story lapses and the rest of the poem is composed of odds and ends of epitheless digressions and satiric tirades. To modern taste, Hudibras is far too long. Some of its best passages suffer from prolixity and too much space is given in it to the discussion of various points of Puritan casuistry. The local and temporary nature of its subject matter is also a serious advantage in the eyes of the reader to do at it is full of wit and vivacity, and even its dogged meter and its astonishing double rhyme, though we tire of them after a while, are, the Dryden said, fitted to the spirit of the purpose of the burlesque. It was Butler's intention to kill Puritanism by ridicule, and we can well understand his poem relighted the court and was a favorite reading of Charles II, who by the by, while he laughed over and praised it, nonetheless permitted the author to spend his last year in poverty. It need hardly be added, however, we are not to but take Butler's picture of Puritanism as complete and final. It is mere caricature. He also only extravagance and the Carlatanism, which were the cause of associated with Puritanism, but its greatness and strength, the elements which rendered it so important, is making of history he not or would not see, or at least he gave them no recognition of work. Thank you for watching. Like, share and subscribe.